The encrypted message arrived at GRU headquarters in Moscow at 3:47 a.m. on April 12, 1943, transmitted from a spy network operating deep inside Wehrmacht-controlled territory, and the intelligence officer who decoded it read the text 3 times before fully comprehending what it meant, his hands beginning to shake as he realized that what he was holding was not just another operational report, but potentially the key to winning or losing the entire war on the Eastern Front, because the message stated with absolute certainty that the German army would launch a massive offensive against the Kursk salient in early July, attacking from both north and south in a pincer movement designed to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces defending the Bulge, and that this operation, codenamed Zitadelle, would involve every available panzer division, including the new Tiger and Panther tanks that German propaganda claimed were invincible. The source was classified as highly reliable, a Soviet intelligence officer named Nikolai Kuznetsov, who had infiltrated German military circles in Ukraine using false identity papers and perfect command of the German language. A man who had been sending accurate intelligence for 18 months and whose previous warnings had proven correct so consistently that ignoring him would be professional suicide. Yet when the report reached Stalin's desk, along with the decoder's assessment that the information was credible and actionable, the Soviet leader's response was skepticism bordering on contempt, because Stalin had been burned before by intelligence that turned out to be German disinformation, and he was not prepared to restructure Soviet defensive planning based on a single spy's report, regardless of how reliable that spy had been in the past. They ignored his warning initially. These generals and commissars who sat in the Kremlin making strategic decisions while hundreds of thousands of soldiers waited at the front wondering whether they would live or die based on choices made in offices thousands of kilometers away, dismissing Kuznetsov's report as possible deception, because the Germans knew that Soviet intelligence had penetrated their command structure and might be feeding false information to manipulate Soviet deployments. A reasonable concern that would have been valid except that multiple independent intelligence sources were all reporting the same thing, that German forces were concentrating around Oral in the north and Kharkov in the south, that massive quantities of ammunition and fuel were being stockpiled in forward depots, that railroad traffic to these areas had increased dramatically, and that German officers were being briefed on an operation that would begin in early summer and that would, in their words, cut off the Kursk salient like a hot knife through butter, destroying 40 Soviet divisions and opening the road to Moscow for a renewed offensive that would finally break Soviet resistance. The confluence of reports from different sources using different methodologies should have been conclusive evidence that Zitadelle was real and imminent, but Stalin had developed a pathological distrust of intelligence during the purges of the 1930s, when paranoia had led him to execute thousands of competent officers on suspicion of treason, and this same paranoia now made him reluctant to accept information that seemed too good to be true, because if the Germans really were planning such an obvious and predictable offensive, then surely it must be a trap designed to lure Soviet forces into a vulnerable position where they could be destroyed by some unexpected German maneuver. We'll pause briefly before continuing. If stories like this are important to you, please consider supporting the video with a like and a subscription. After watching, a short comment, even a simple one, helps these stories reach further. Your support ensures they are not forgotten. Thank you. Let's continue. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who had emerged as Stalin's most trusted military advisor after his successful defense of Moscow in 1941 and his role in the Stalingrad encirclement in 1942, took a different view of the intelligence, believing that Kuznetsov's report was accurate and that the Germans were indeed planning to attack Kursk, but that this presented an opportunity rather than a threat, because if Soviet forces knew exactly when and where the German offensive would come, then they could prepare defences in depth that would bleed the Wehrmacht white and create conditions for a devastating counter-offensive that might drive German forces all the way back to Poland. Zhukov argued in a meeting on April 15th that the correct response to the intelligence was not to launch a preemptive attack, as some generals were suggesting, but rather to build the most formidable defensive system ever constructed, using the 3 months before the German offensive to dig trenches and anti-tank ditches, lay millions of mines, position thousands of anti-tank guns, and create multiple defensive lines so deep that German armour would exhaust itself trying to break through, at which point fresh Soviet tank armies held in reserve would counterattack and destroy the weakened German formations, turning Zitadelle from a German offensive into a German catastrophe. Stalin listened to Zhukov's proposal with his characteristic inscrutability, smoking his pipe and occasionally asking questions that seemed designed more to test whether Zhukov had thought through every contingency than to actually understand the operational details, because Stalin's management style involved letting his subordinates present plans and then looking for weaknesses and contradictions that would justify rejecting their proposals. A technique that had served him well in political infighting, but that was less effective in military planning where perfection was impossible, and where waiting for the perfect plan meant never taking action at all. The crucial question Stalin posed during this meeting was how Zhukov could be certain that the intelligence was accurate, that this was not an elaborate German deception designed to make Soviet forces concentrate at Kursk, while the real offensive came somewhere else, perhaps against Moscow or Leningrad, or in the south toward the Caucasus oil fields. And Zhukov's response was that absolute certainty was impossible, but that the convergence of multiple independent intelligence sources made the Kursk offensive overwhelmingly probable, and that even if there was a 10% chance the intelligence was false, the 90% probability that it was accurate justified building defences at Kursk because the cost of being wrong was manageable, while the cost of ignoring accurate intelligence would be catastrophic. What Kuznetsov had said in his report, in the terse language of military intelligence that stripped away all ambiguity and emotional content, was that German forces would attack on or around July 5th with approximately 900,000 troops, 2,700 tanks, including significant numbers of Tigers and Panthers, 2,000 aircraft, and 10,000 artillery pieces, concentrating their effort on 2 narrow penetration corridors north and south of the Kursk Bulge, with the objective of meeting somewhere east of Kursk and thereby encircling Soviet forces in the salient, and that German commanders were confident of success because they believed Soviet forces were still weak from the winter campaigns and would not be able to stop a concentrated armoured thrust supported by massive artillery preparation and close air support. This assessment of German thinking proved remarkably accurate, reflecting Kuznetsov's deep penetration of Wehrmacht officer circles and his ability to distinguish between official propaganda and actual operational planning. But it also revealed the fundamental flaw in German strategy, the assumption that Soviet forces would react to Zitadelle the same way they had reacted to previous German offensives, with improvised defences and hasty counterattacks, rather than with the methodical preparation that advance warning made possible, an assumption that would cost the Wehrmacht hundreds of thousands of casualties and destroy any remaining German capacity for strategic offensive operations on the Eastern Front. The defensive preparation that began in April 1943 transformed the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified position in military history, with Soviet engineers and infantry digging 8 successive defensive lines extending 175 kilometers deep, each line consisting of trenches, bunkers, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and concealed artillery positions, creating a defensive system so extensive that even if German forces broke through 1 or 2 lines, they would face 6 more before reaching open ground, and by that point their tanks would be low on fuel and ammunition, and their infantry would be exhausted and demoralised from fighting through successive obstacles under constant artillery fire. The scale of this defensive effort was staggering. Over 500,000 anti-tank mines and 420,000 anti-personnel mines were laid across the projected German attack corridors, creating minefields so dense that German armour could not advance without triggering explosions that would disable tracks or blow off wheels. And behind these minefields, Soviet engineers positioned 6,000 anti-tank guns, mostly 76mm divisional guns and 45mm anti-tank guns that were obsolete against German heavy armour but deadly against lighter vehicles and supporting infantry, creating overlapping fields of fire that would force German tanks to choose between advancing through mines or exposing their thinner side armour to flanking fire. The anti-tank ditches were particularly ingenious, designed not just as obstacles, but as killing zones where German tanks would be channeled into narrow corridors where Soviet gunners could engage them at close range, and these ditches were positioned on reverse slopes where German tanks would not see them until they crested a ridge and found themselves unable to stop before sliding into the ditch, leaving them immobilized and vulnerable to pre-sighted artillery fire that could destroy them before they could reverse out. Soviet military engineers had studied German tactics extensively, understanding that panzer formations relied on speed and concentration to break through defences before the defenders could react, and that slowing down the German advance even slightly would allow Soviet artillery and anti-tank guns to inflict disproportionate casualties, turning the German advantage in armour quality into a disadvantage because slow-moving tanks were easier targets than fast-moving ones, and because German tanks were designed for offensive manoeuvre rather than defensive grinding matches where armour thickness mattered less than mechanical reliability and crew endurance. The statistical preparation for Kursk revealed the extent to which Soviet military planning had evolved since the catastrophic defeats of 1941, because instead of simply massing forces at the front line and hoping for the best, Soviet commanders used intelligence about German force concentrations to calculate exactly how many defensive positions would be needed to absorb the German assault, how deep the defensive zones needed to be to exhaust German momentum, and how large the strategic reserve needed to be to launch effective counteroffensives once German forces had been weakened, creating a defensive system based on mathematics and logistics rather than hope and improvisation. The numbers involved were extraordinary. 1,300,000 Soviet troops defended the Kursk salient, supported by 3,600 tanks, 2,650 aircraft, and 20,000 artillery pieces, creating a defensive density unprecedented in military history, with Soviet forces outnumbering German attackers by approximately 1.4 to 1 overall, but enjoying much greater local superiority in the prepared defensive positions where they could concentrate fire from multiple directions against German forces advancing through predictable corridors. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the Central Front north of Kursk, understood better than most Soviet commanders what the intelligence warning meant for defensive planning, because he had fought German armour throughout 1941 and 1942 and had learned the hard way that meeting panzer attacks head-on was suicidal, that the only way to defeat German tanks was to force them into situations where their advantages in mobility and firepower were neutralised by obstacles and concentrated anti-tank fire, and he used the 3 months of preparation time to create exactly these conditions across his entire front, positioning his strongest divisions in the sectors where intelligence indicated the main German thrusts would come, holding weaker divisions in secondary sectors, and keeping powerful armoured reserves 20 to 30 kilometres behind the front line where they could counterattack German penetrations without being caught in the initial artillery barrage that would precede the German assault. Rokossovsky's defensive plan was based on the assumption that German forces would break through the first defensive line, possibly the second as well, because stopping them completely at the front line was impossible given German superiority in armour and artillery, but that by the time they reached the third or fourth line, their momentum would be exhausted and their forces would be vulnerable to counterattack, a plan that required accepting initial territorial losses in exchange for inflicting maximum casualties on German armour, a trade-off that was psychologically difficult for Soviet commanders who who had been trained to defend every metre of Soviet soil. But that was militarily sound given the intelligence about German objectives and force composition. The deception operations designed to convince the Germans that their offensive plans remained secret were almost as elaborate as the defensive preparations, involving fake radio traffic suggesting Soviet forces were preparing their own offensive elsewhere, carefully controlled leaks of false information through channels known to be monitored by German intelligence, and visible defensive construction in sectors away from the actual German attack corridors to suggest that Soviet forces had misidentified where Zittadel would strike, all designed to preserve German confidence that they retained strategic surprise and would therefore commit their forces fully to the offensive rather than holding back reserves in case the Soviets had penetrated their planning. These deception efforts succeeded brilliantly, with German commanders reporting to Berlin in late June that Soviet forces appeared unprepared for the coming offensive and that Zittadel would likely achieve its objectives within 2 weeks. Assessment that reflected exactly the kind of overconfidence that Zhukov wanted to encourage, because overconfident enemies made mistakes and committed reserves prematurely and persisted in failed attacks longer than prudent commanders would, all of which would make the eventual German defeat more complete and more costly. The final intelligence update from Kuznetsov arrived on July 2nd, confirming that the German offensive would begin on July 5th at dawn following a massive artillery preparation, and this message included specific details about German objectives for the first day of the offensive. The 9th Army attacking from the north would attempt to penetrate 15 kilometres and capture the town of Olkovatka, while the 4th Panzer Army attacking from the south would drive toward Oboyan and attempt to penetrate 20 kilometres, with both forces expecting to meet somewhere near Kursk within a week and thereby complete the encirclement. The precision of this intelligence allowed Soviet commanders to position their strongest units exactly where they would be most needed, concentrating anti-tank guns and armoured reserves in the sectors that would face the heaviest German attacks, and to prepare counter-battery fire missions targeting German artillery positions that would begin simultaneously with the German bombardment, degrading German fire support before the infantry assault even began, a level of tactical preparation that would have been impossible without the advance warning that Kuznetsov's intelligence had provided. What happened when the German offensive finally began on July 5th, 1943, at 4:30 a.m. with a rolling barrage from 10,000 artillery pieces that was supposed to pulverize Soviet defenses and clear the way for panzer divisions to break through, was not what German commanders had expected or planned for, because instead of catching Soviet forces by surprise, the German bombardment fell on positions that had been evacuated hours earlier, based on intelligence about the timing and targeting of the artillery preparation, meaning that thousands of German shells exploded harmlessly in empty trenches while Soviet troops waited in secondary positions. And when the German bombardment ended and panzer formations began their advance, they immediately encountered minefields that had been carefully positioned based on intelligence about German attack routes, and these minefields channeled German armour into killing zones where anti-tank guns waited in camouflaged positions to engage them at close range, turning the expected rapid breakthrough into a grinding battle of attrition that consumed German armour at an unsustainable rate. The northern pincer of the German offensive, spearheaded by the 9th Army under General Walter Model, advanced only 6 kilometres on the first day, despite employing over 900 tanks, including significant numbers of Tigers and the new Ferdinand tank destroyers that mounted 88mm guns, because every kilometre of advance required fighting through multiple defensive lines while under constant artillery fire and air attack from Soviet ground attack aircraft that had been pre-positioned based on intelligence about German assembly areas. And by the evening of July 5th, Model's forces had suffered over 25,000 casualties and lost 200 tanks, a casualty rate that was clearly unsustainable and that should have prompted reconsideration of the entire offensive, but that instead led to the commitment of additional reserves in an attempt to achieve the breakthrough that German planning assumed would occur within the first 24 hours. The southern pincer under General Hermann Hoth advanced slightly further, penetrating 12 kilometres on the first day and capturing several villages, but at the cost of over 350 tanks and 30,000 casualties, and more importantly, without achieving the clean breakthrough that would have allowed exploitation into the Soviet rear, instead creating a narrow salient that was vulnerable to counterattack from both flanks and that required constant reinforcement to prevent Soviet forces from cutting it off. The Battle of Prokhorovka on July 12th represented the climax of the German offensive and the decisive demonstration of how advanced intelligence had allowed Soviet forces to prepare a trap that would destroy German armoured capability. Because when the SS Panzer Corps committed its remaining tanks to a final push toward Oboyan, expecting to break through weakened Soviet defences and reach open terrain where their superior armour and training would be decisive, they instead encountered the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, which had been held in reserve specifically for this moment, and which attacked the German flank with over 800 tanks, creating a massive armoured engagement at close range where German advantages in long-range gunnery were nullified and where Soviet numerical superiority could be brought to bear, and the resulting battle destroyed over 300 German tanks in a single day while costing the Soviets approximately 500 tanks, a trade ratio that favoured Germany tactically but that was strategically catastrophic for the Wehrmacht because Soviet tank production was replacing losses within weeks, while German tank production could not keep pace with the destruction rate, meaning that every tank lost at Prokhorovka was irreplaceable, while every Soviet tank lost would be replaced, and the replacements would be better trained and better equipped than the tanks they replaced. The decision to halt Zitadelle came on July the 13th, when Hitler met with his generals and admitted that the offensive had failed to achieve its objectives, that Soviet resistance was far stronger than intelligence had suggested, and that continuing the attack would only result in additional casualties that Germany could not afford. A remarkable admission from a leader who typically insisted on fighting to the last man regardless of circumstances. And this decision to terminate the offensive represented the last time Germany would have sufficient armoured strength to conduct strategic offensive operations on the Eastern Front, marking the transition from a war where Germany might still win to a war where the only question was how long Germany could delay inevitable defeat. The casualty figures told the story of this transition. Germany lost approximately 200,000 men killed, wounded, or captured during Zitadelle, along with 760 tanks and 1,400 aircraft, losses that consumed the reserves built up during 6 months of relative quiet and that could not be replaced before Soviet counteroffensives began, while Soviet casualties, though higher in absolute numbers at approximately 320,000 men and 1,600 tanks, represented a much smaller percentage of available forces and were being replaced even as the battle continued through Soviet production and mobilization that was outpacing German capabilities by a widening margin. The strategic impact of Kursk extended far beyond the immediate battlefield casualties, because the failure of Zitadelle convinced Germany's allies that the war was unwinnable and accelerated their defection from the Axis, convinced German generals that Hitler's strategic judgment was fatally flawed and planted the seeds of the July 1944 assassination attempt, and convinced Stalin that Soviet military planning had evolved to the point where it could compete with German staff work, creating confidence that enabled the massive offensives of 1944 that would drive German forces out of the Soviet Union entirely and carry the Red Army to Berlin. The intelligence that had made this victory possible, Kuznetsov's reports that had been initially ignored by Stalin and that had required Zhukov's advocacy to be taken seriously, had proven decisively that knowing the enemy's plans in advance was worth more than numerical superiority or superior weapons, because it allowed defensive preparations that could neutralize enemy advantages and create conditions where the defender's strengths could be maximized, a lesson that would shape Soviet military doctrine throughout the Cold War, and that would influence how intelligence agencies thought about the relationship between information and military power. Kuznetsov himself did not survive the war, killed by Ukrainian nationalist partisans in March 1944 while operating undercover in western Ukraine, his death occurring just as the strategic victory he had helped create was being consolidated through Soviet offensives that were driving German forces out of Ukraine and Belarus, and his role in the Kursk victory remained classified for decades after the war, mentioned only obliquely in Soviet military histories that credited intelligence sources with providing advance warning, but that did not identify specific individuals for security reasons. The methodology that Kuznetsov used to penetrate German planning circles represented intelligence tradecraft at its finest, involving the creation of a false identity as a German officer from the Baltic region whose records had been destroyed during Soviet occupation, giving him plausible deniability about his background, while his fluent German and knowledge of Wehrmacht procedures allowed him to blend seamlessly into occupied Ukraine's German military administration. And over 18 months he cultivated relationships with German staff officers who trusted him sufficiently to discuss operational planning in his presence, never suspecting that this competent German-speaking officer was actually a Soviet intelligence operative transmitting their most secret plans to Moscow through a radio network that operated from safe houses in Kiev and Lvov. The risk Kuznetsov accepted was extraordinary, because discovery would mean not just execution, but torture designed to extract information about his network and his methods. Yet he continued operating even after several close calls where German security services investigated irregularities in his cover story, each time using his language skills and quick thinking to deflect suspicion, while knowing that eventually his luck would run out and he would be caught. The transmission of intelligence from Kuznetsov to Moscow involved multiple steps designed to prevent the Germans from detecting the radio signals or tracing them back to their source, with Kuznetsov writing his reports in code and passing them to a courier network that moved them to a transmission site kilometers away from where Kuznetsov actually worked. And from there, radio operators would encode the messages a second time using one-time pads that made decryption impossible even if Germans intercepted the transmission, and then burst transmissions lasting only seconds would send the information to Soviet receiving stations where it would be decoded and analysed before being forwarded to GRU headquarters, the entire process designed to create separation between the source and the transmission, so that even if Germans detected the radio signals, they could not trace them back to Kuznetsov himself, though this multi-layer security also created delays that meant urgent intelligence, sometimes arrived hours or days after it would have been most valuable, a frustrating but necessary compromise between security and timeliness. The German perspective on Kursk revealed the catastrophic consequences of intelligence failure, because Wehrmacht commanders had convinced themselves that Zitadel would achieve surprise despite numerous indicators that Soviet forces knew the offensive was coming, indicators that included Soviet defensive construction visible from aerial reconnaissance, increased radio traffic suggesting troop movements to the Kursk area, and intelligence reports from their own sources suggesting that Soviet forces were preparing for a major German offensive, all of which should have prompted reconsideration of whether Zitadel could succeed, but which were instead explained away as Soviet defensive measures that would be inadequate against concentrated panzer attacks. A classic example of confirmation bias where commanders see what they want to see and ignore evidence that contradicts their preferred narrative. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South and responsible for the southern pincer of Zitadel, later wrote in his memoirs that he had expressed concerns about the offensive's timing and objectives, but had been overruled by Hitler, who insisted that the operation proceed as planned, though Manstein's memoirs were written after the war when he had every incentive to distance himself from failed operations and blame them on political interference rather than acknowledging his own misjudgments. The tactical experience of German soldiers during Kursk revealed the psychological impact of advancing into prepared defences where every advantage had been stripped away, because panzer crews who had dominated battlefields from Poland to France to the initial phase of Barbarossa suddenly found themselves fighting blind through minefields where visibility was measured in metres and where Soviet anti-tank guns fired from concealed positions at ranges so close that German armour advantages were meaningless, and infantry who had grown accustomed to Soviet forces collapsing under German pressure instead encountered troops who fought from fortified positions and who counter-attacked immediately when German forces paused to regroup, creating a grinding battle of attrition that German doctrine was not designed for and that German training had not prepared soldiers to fight, because the Wehrmacht's entire operational concept was built on manoeuvre and breakthrough, while Kursk required accepting casualties and continuing to attack positions that showed no signs of weakening. A fundamentally different type of warfare that played to Soviet strengths in endurance and industrial capacity, while negating German advantages in tactical sophistication and crew quality. A German tank commander named Otto Carius, who fought at Kursk in a Tiger tank and whose memoir provided detailed accounts of the battle from the German perspective, described the moment his unit first encountered Soviet defences on July 5th, writing that they had been told to expect disorganised resistance that would collapse after the initial artillery barrage, but instead they advanced into a landscape that seemed designed specifically to destroy German armour, with every ridgeline concealing anti-tank guns, every depression hiding infantry with anti-tank rifles, every seeming gap in the defences actually a channel leading into a minefield, and the realization gradually dawning on the German crews that they were not fighting confused Soviet defenders, but rather walking into a trap that had been prepared with full knowledge of German intentions and German routes of advance. Carius wrote that by the end of the first day, his company had lost 5 of its 14 Tigers to a combination of mines, anti-tank guns, and close-range attacks by Soviet tanks that appeared from unexpected directions, casualties that were shocking because Tigers were supposed to be nearly invulnerable, and their loss meant that German armoured superiority was illusory when facing enemies who knew where attacks would come and who had prepared accordingly. The Prokhorovka engagement on July 12th became legendary in Soviet military history as the largest tank battle ever fought, though subsequent research has questioned whether it was actually larger than other Eastern Front engagements and whether Soviet claims about German casualties were accurate. But regardless of the specific numbers, what is undeniable is that Prokhorovka represented the moment when German commanders realized that Zitadel had failed, and that continuing the offensive would only result in additional casualties that could not be justified by any reasonable expectation of success, because the SS Panzer Corps that attacked at Prokhorovka was the Wehrmacht's elite armoured reserve, and if these formations could not break through Soviet defences, then no German force could, meaning that the offensive had reached its culminating point where further attacks would be counterproductive. The Soviet decision to commit the 5th Guards Tank Army at Prokhorovka, rather than holding it in reserve, reflected confidence based on intelligence that German forces were nearing exhaustion and that one more major blow would break their offensive capability. And while the resulting battle was tactically costly for Soviet forces, destroying hundreds of Soviet tanks in a single day, it was strategically decisive because it convinced Hitler to terminate Zitadel and shift German forces to Italy, where Allied landings had created a new crisis that required immediate response. The defensive depth that characterized Soviet preparations at Kursk would become a standard feature of Soviet military doctrine throughout the Cold War, with the concept of multiple defensive belts designed to absorb enemy attacks and create conditions for counteroffensive becoming the foundation of how Soviet planners thought about defending against NATO forces in Central Europe, a direct application of lessons learned when Kuznetsov's intelligence had provided time to implement Zhukov's defensive plan, and that plan had proven devastatingly effective against the best forces Germany could deploy, demonstrating that properly prepared defences with adequate depth could defeat even superior attacking forces if the defenders knew where and when the attack would come and could position their forces accordingly. The mathematical precision of Soviet defensive planning at Kursk, with calculations about how many anti-tank guns per kilometre were needed to stop German armour and how deep defensive zones needed to be to exhaust German momentum, became the basis for elaborate computer models that Soviet military planners would use during the Cold War to design defences against hypothetical NATO attacks, though the fundamental insight remained the same: that advance intelligence about enemy intentions was the most valuable force multiplier available because it allowed defending forces to prepare positions that would maximize their strengths while exploiting enemy weaknesses. The intelligence failure from the German perspective had multiple causes, but fundamentally reflected overconfidence in German military superiority and underestimation of Soviet capabilities. Because Wehrmacht intelligence services had spent 2 years compiling reports about Soviet disorganization and poor training and inadequate equipment, all of which had been accurate in 1941 and early 1942, but which had become progressively less accurate as Soviet industry mobilized and Soviet forces learned from their defeats. And this created a situation where German intelligence was reporting based on outdated assumptions while Soviet capabilities were evolving rapidly. And by mid-1943, the gap between German perceptions of Soviet military effectiveness and the actual state of Soviet forces was so vast that German planning was essentially based on fighting an enemy that no longer existed. An enemy that would panic under pressure and collapse when attacked by concentrated armour, rather than the enemy that actually existed at Kursk. An enemy that had prepared elaborate defences based on accurate intelligence about German plans, and that was ready to trade space for casualties in a grinding battle that would destroy German offensive capability. The role of Soviet partisans in providing intelligence that corroborated Kuznetsov's reports has been underappreciated in most histories of Kursk, because while Kuznetsov provided strategic intelligence about German intentions and timing, partisan networks operating behind German lines provided tactical intelligence about German force movements and supply concentrations, reporting the arrival of specific panzer divisions at forward assembly areas, identifying the locations of German fuel and ammunition dumps, and even capturing German officers whose interrogation provided details about Zitadel's operational plan that confirmed Kuznetsov's information from independent sources, creating a comprehensive intelligence picture that gave Soviet commanders confidence that they understood German plans completely and could prepare defences that would address every aspect of the German operational concept. The partisan contribution to the Kursk victory extended beyond intelligence to include sabotage operations that disrupted German logistics in the weeks before the offensive, destroying railway bridges and derailing supply trains and attacking fuel convoys, operations that were coordinated with Soviet defensive planning to maximize their impact on German offensive capabilities and that degraded German combat readiness in ways that were difficult for German commanders to quantify, but that cumulatively reduced the combat power available for Zitadel by perhaps 10 to 15%, enough to make the difference between an offensive that might have succeeded and one that was certain to fail. The failure of German intelligence to detect Soviet defensive preparations at the scale they were actually occurring represented a systemic failure of Wehrmacht reconnaissance and analysis, because while German aerial reconnaissance photographed, Soviet defensive construction, and German signals intelligence intercepted Soviet radio traffic suggesting troop movements to Kursk, the intelligence analysts responsible for interpreting this information consistently underestimated the extent of Soviet preparations, reporting that Soviet forces had constructed 2 or 3 defensive lines when in fact 8 lines had been built, estimating Soviet force strength at perhaps 800,000 troops when the actual number was over 1,300,000, and assessing Soviet defensive planning as improvised and reactive when it was actually methodical and based on accurate intelligence about German intentions, failures of analysis that reflected both the limitations of German intelligence collection methods and the success of Soviet deception operations that were designed to make defensive preparations appear less extensive than they actually were, creating a situation where German commanders attacked believing they faced manageable opposition when they actually faced the most formidable defensive system ever constructed. The American and British military observers who were briefed on the Battle of Kursk in late 1943 as part of wartime intelligence sharing were stunned by the scale of the defensive preparations and the effectiveness of Soviet defensive planning, because Western military doctrine at that time did not emphasize defensive depth to anything like the extent Soviet doctrine did, and the idea of building 8 successive defensive lines seemed wasteful of resources and manpower when those same resources could have been used to build stronger forward defenses or to create larger mobile reserves for counterattacks. But the Soviet approach reflected a fundamentally different philosophy about how to defeat armoured offensives, accepting that some penetration was inevitable and planning to exhaust attacking forces through progressive resistance rather than trying to stop them at the border. A philosophy that would influence how NATO thought about defending Western Europe during the Cold War, when facing the possibility of Soviet armoured attacks that would employ the same tactics that had worked for Germany in 1941, but that Kursk had shown could be defeated through adequate preparation and defensive depth. The technological evolution that Kursk accelerated included Soviet development of more powerful anti-tank guns and improved tank designs that incorporated lessons from fighting German Tigers and Panthers, because the battle demonstrated that existing Soviet 45mm and 76mm anti-tank guns were marginally effective against heavy German armour, and that new weapons were needed, leading to the rapid deployment of 85mm and 100mm guns that could reliably penetrate Tiger armour at combat ranges, and the development of the T-34-85 tank with its improved gun and thicker armour that would become the standard Soviet medium tank for the remainder of the war. Technological advances that were directly attributable to the tactical lessons learned during Kursk, when Soviet forces had struggled to destroy German heavy armour with existing weapons, and when commanders had submitted detailed reports about what equipment they needed to fight more effectively, reports that Soviet industry responded to with remarkable speed by designing and producing new weapons within months rather than years. The psychological impact of Kursk on German morale extended far beyond the immediate casualties, because the offensive had been presented to German troops as the operation that would reverse the momentum of the war and restore German dominance on the Eastern Front. And when it failed so completely and so obviously, the result was widespread demoralization and questioning of whether victory was still possible, doubts that German propaganda tried to suppress, but that spread through the ranks as soldiers who had fought at Kursk told their stories to troops in other units, describing the endless defensive lines and the relentless Soviet counterattacks and the feeling of fighting against an enemy that seemed to know exactly what the Germans would do and where they would do it, stories that eroded confidence in German military leadership and that made subsequent defensive battles more difficult, because troops who believe they cannot win fight less effectively than troops who retain hope of victory, a psychological deterioration that contributed to the progressive collapse of German defensive capabilities in 1944 and 1945 as much as the material losses of men and equipment. The long-term strategic consequences of Kursk included the permanent shift of initiative to the Soviet Union, because after Zitadel failed, Germany never again had sufficient armoured strength to conduct strategic offensive operations and was forced into a defensive posture for the remainder of the war, reacting to Soviet initiatives rather than imposing its will on the battlefield, a reversal that was obvious to both German and Soviet commanders, and that shaped how each side approached subsequent operations, with Soviet forces growing increasingly confident and ambitious in their offensive planning, while German forces became progressively more cautious and conservative, knowing that every loss was irreplaceable while Soviet strength continued to grow. The intelligence advantage that had enabled the Kursk victory also proved sustainable, with Soviet intelligence networks continuing to provide accurate information about German force dispositions and operational plans throughout 1944 and 1945, not always with the same precision as Kuznetsov's reports about Zitadel, but consistently enough that Soviet commanders could plan offensives with reasonable confidence that they understood German defensive capabilities and could concentrate forces at points where German defenses were weakest, creating a cumulative intelligence advantage that complemented Soviet material superiority and that made German defeat increasingly inevitable as the war progressed. The delayed recognition of Kuznetsov's contribution to the Kursk victory, which finally came in the 1990s when Russian archives were partially opened and historians could document the intelligence operation that had preceded the battle, illustrated how intelligence work often goes unrecognized because revealing sources and methods could compromise ongoing operations, creating a situation where the most important contributions to victory remain hidden while more visible achievements are celebrated, though in the end the results speak for themselves. Kursk was won because Soviet forces knew what was coming and prepared accordingly, and they knew what was coming because a GRU officer had penetrated German planning and reported accurately despite the risks, and his reports had been believed and acted upon despite initial skepticism from Stalin, who had to be convinced by Zhukov that the intelligence was credible, and that combination of effective intelligence collection, correct analysis, and wise operational planning produced a victory that changed the trajectory of World War II and demonstrated that wars are won not just by courage and firepower, but by knowing what the enemy intends to do, and using that knowledge to create conditions where the enemy's strengths become weaknesses and where defensive preparation can neutralize offensive superiority. Lessons that remain relevant to military planning in the 21st century, when intelligence collection technologies have become more sophisticated, but when the fundamental principle remains unchanged, that knowing the enemy's plans in advance is worth more than numerical superiority or technological advantage, because it allows forces to position themselves optimally and to prepare defenses that address specific threats rather than generic possibilities, turning intelligence into operational success and operational success into strategic victory.